Point Break, are you here?
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
It's Point Being, but
Oh, Point
point
Being, sorry.
Point Break is funny too. It reminds me of Avengers when because Tony Stark calls Thor Point Break.
Yeah, for some reason I had the vision of Keanu Reeves. Just like the movie.
Are we live right now then in the
Yeah, we're live.
on
We're on
YouTube?
stage.
Okay.
Everyone sees us.
Hey everybody, who's over there? I was getting mixed up because there's a sort of lag between the different channels, and so there's lots of overlap. But yeah, so thanks for having me as part of this event. It's pretty cool. A lot of it's over my head. To be frank, like just a lot of the tech stuff. I mean, I'm literate in it. I keep up with it. I know the difference between blockchain and holochain and a lot of these things, but it just moves so fast. And it's programming, hacking, etc. It's not my thing, let alone my forte, but I'm interested in how all these things dovetail. So um are you guys still there? Is it just me talking
No,
and nobody
I'm
else?
still here if you need me.
Okay.
I
Okay.
was turning the
Okay.
floor over to you. Do you?
No,
Uh,
it's good. It's good. Just when you disappear on my screen, I like don't know what's still visible and what's not. Like for YouTube,
so right now
I
it's
just
it's you, me, and Peace, I believe, are all visible.
okay, cool. So yeah, I've written a lot about meta theory. I try to sort of meta theory, meta modernism. I try to theorize it myself, but also just track what else is going on out there. And I titled this segment meta modernizing the world, because I think that's what you're trying to do, and I wanted to kind of use it as a prompt for myself to develop this as a concept, because as I was saying to Tommy before, like there's a lot of literature about postmodernization as a kind of thesis, as a process, right? And people talk about postmodernism as a period, as a set of movements and philosophies and art, whatnot. But it's much more complex than that, and there's all these other modernizations, especially in the last 3 decades. You have make notes to myself here, but you have um, hyper, digi, postmodernism, cosmo, alter, auto, neo, super, trans, meta modernism. So there's actually a ton of overlap, a ton of redundancy. It's very frustrating as a scholar, and then that's just the scholarship side of it, not to mention the hacking side of it, the activism side of it. So a large part of my kind of mo and my impetus is to be a part of the like explicitly socialist movement politically, right? So whenever somebody mentions politics, like there was another sort of politics themed talk today, it's like, what are we really talking about? Because there's the kind of theories of politics, but then there's the actual people engaged in lifelong struggles. And so for me, the Bernie Sanders movement dovetails with a lot of these things, but it's not explicit enough. The connections aren't drawn together on both sides of the equation, right? So when people talk about UBI, which has been a theme today, and things like that, the commons, it's these dovetail with the socialism kind of tradition, right? But the word itself is very problematized, very compromised, very misused and misunderstood. And so I'm just kind of foregrounding that, because I'm not really like talking about politics today per se. We're past that political moment too, over the past 5 years, where it would have been better to have the integration of that, have these movements which came to very close tipping points actually succeed instead of fail. But nevertheless, here we are. And so I guess the gap in my personal life too is cryptocurrencies and NFTs, and whatever the hot topic of the day is. It's getting away from me very quickly, and it doesn't relate to people's day-to-day struggle. But I think that can be corrected just by talking about these things in different ways. And so another thing Tommy and I touched on was, how the meta narrative itself is told, what the story of it is. And so, talking about it's one thing, and also just creating the artifacts of documentaries and movies and music and games to kind of create the narrative that's emerging, and the seeds of a kind of paradigm shift, even a meta modern paradigm shift. I think they go back, uh, you know, throughout the past century, just like the seeds of postmodernism and postmodernization go back through modernity, through those many centuries of the evolution of these things. So we're on this kind of cusp in this very conflicted transition period, and I've tried to distill, narrativistically into two main paths. Basically, postmodernism bifurcates into metamodernism and hypermodernism, and sort of narrowing it down to those two choices actually just reorients and reframes a lot of open questions about the role of technology and the role of finance and stuff like that. And so I guess I'm hoping we can transition sort of from the things I'm saying into a kind of group discussion, and I can like field questions and ask questions back. And because I like a lot of people had presentations and great visuals and stuff, and unfortunately I'm not so prepared today in terms of knowing exactly what to deliver, because as I said at the outset, like this type of event is above my pay grade, frankly, which my pay grade is 0. So it comes back to this issue of like funding. How is activism funded? How is art funded? How is like how do we sustain ourselves? How do we create value sort of out of nothing?
You bring up a lot of really great points, and if you'd like, I'll inject a little bit. So, you asked one of the key points, like how do we get paid? Because you're getting paid 0. I also am getting paid 0. I don't have a job that has any kind of payment. Everything that I've been doing for the past year and a half is kind of network effect payment. So there's a lot of great projects that you can be a part of that you benefit from, and there is monetary rewards for, but the expectation of payment is completely gone. And the stuff that I do isn't because I know I'm going to get a paycheck, or someone told me you are now required to work for 8 hours and we're going to pay you this cap and that's what you're worth to us. It's all because I'm doing things that I want to do. And I think that really is what ties into meta, and kind of what we've heard from the communities is that we're tired of being told what we want and how we want things and how to go about getting them. And I think that speaks a lot to kind of the trouble with getting a singular idea for the paradigm shift, is that the the cries and the needs are very decentralized. Now, there's a lot of rebellion of people that just don't like how things were before. And so there is like a transition from the way that they were. And COVID has been a huge factor in that. With modernization and modernity, one of the key aspects has always been globalization. How much connected are you to the people around you? And the people, and like when we built the railroads, being able to cross the country for the first time in a cheap and effective way brought a whole new paradigm, as well as when the mail system first started. People are finally able to send a letter to someone that they are probably never going to meet in their life. And now we went from the internet, now we're a completely like digital first nation. Like Tommy, Pete, a lot of the people that are in metagame, I've never met personally, and the chances of me meeting them are probably going to be because I went on a vacation and one of us was like spent a ton of money and crossed the world, and we all got together and said, "Hey, how's it going?" But
MetaFest next year. What are you talking about?
yeah. Well, for me to be as effective as I am a digital first kind of citizen, and I don't even want to know how much effort this would be if we were trying to do this in person. It might be a little bit easier getting someone up on the stage than to figure out if they can screen share, but the power that we're able to coordinate means that I can sit here and make breakfast for my daughter when she gets hungry. It means that all of us can contribute and be part of this without having to give up what we were doing. So I think there's going to be a big pushback to return to how things were, and I think that's part of this metamodernism.
Oh shit, we were supposed to eat today?
No, I forgot myself, so I fed the little one, but I am getting pretty hungry.
Yeah, that's all key. I mean, globalization stands out for me as very operative, and not for the obvious reasons, but because it goes back so far. You know, like you mentioned, mail and the internet. Like we've had a kind of public internet for like 30 years, but you know, the ideas of globalization go back to antiquity. You know, people were making those efforts to think cosmopolitan without ever not only not meeting other people, but not even having the chance to go meet somebody on a different continent, but nonetheless having that kind of consciousness. And these types of things have gone through a, you know, different ideological bottlenecks, like new age movements, right? Like, you know, sounds good in theory, right? Like we're all, you know, kind of Gaia consciousness, but then there's like a whole dark side to new age movements, a whole economic underbelly, you know. And just case in point is like I keep seeing these Gaia ads on Facebook, and they're talking about reptilians and Atlanteans, and it's like, that's just, you know, it's whatever. It's like charming pop culture fluff when you're a kid, but it's like totally anti-intellectual when you're trying to be an adult, you know, make the world a better place. And it comes back to, I guess, Moloch, you know, and that kind of, those kind of topics, like you were talking with Benet earlier. You know, he's a good kind of ally, somebody I know, as well as Peter Lindbergh. But these things aren't without their challenges too. You know, the different meta spaces, and or Game B, which, you know, it kind of appropriates some of the meta kind of language, but it's a different beast, you know. And so Vinay and I have aligned over criticizing them. Nonetheless, like, we do have some common long-term goals, right? 50 to 100 years, we're talking about the complete kind of reorganization of the social order, and saving the world from climate collapse and all these sorts of things. So yeah, it's like moment to moment. Okay, where do we go from here? You know, there's a big what's next, a big so what factor. But at the same time, these things take years to unfold.
It seems like that unfolding is getting a little faster lately.
Yeah.
I think for part of people it is, but there's also an active effort to coerce people and provide misinformation. And I think we've seen that this past year too. The power to disrupt people is also amplified by the ability to connect to multiple people. And I mean, even in the 2016 election, when we saw like the cult of Keck kind of step up and step into like memification, iconoclast magic kind of role, where they, I mean, their own words are that they manifested Donald Trump to become president through meme. That's their claim, not mine. But Facebook and Google are actively listening to everything that we say, and if you say something, they're going to put you a personalized ad for it on anyone around you's phone. So, you know, our connections are dangerous.
Curiously enough, like with that sort of thing, I always find I'm getting marketed for things I've already bought, so I'm not so paranoid about them listening. Like if I say, oh, I'm thinking about this, and then an ad appears, it's like I really think they're kind of on the other side of it, where the algorithms and the listening, it's actually quite crude, right? And I think, you know, to my mind goes to like Edward Snowden and his exposés of the NSA, right? We love to like glamorize intelligence agencies, but really, yeah, like, yes, they're listening to all of us, but nobody's actually hearing what we're saying, or what the meaning is, what the relevance is. Like, it's just sheer volume processing, and it's quite politically charged and quite run by incompetent ideologues. So the whole facade of that kind of Big Brother, while it's very real, it's also kind of crumbling in my view. And I'm looking at Facebook and think, the documentaries like The Social Dilemma, and like, this is stuff a lot of us already knew 10 years ago. So we're not that sort of co-opted and captured by it, because we're trying to, get ahead of the curve. So, but that's really the case, I find, with things marketed to me. I'll buy some like LED lights off Amazon, and then it's all of a sudden it's marketing me more of that thing I've already bought, so not as efficient as the doomsayers proclaimed it is. And I've also written a lot about, conspiracy and, just like, trying to actually like make myself a target in some way, but it's never, not actually just I write things that would kind of send up red flags, and yet it never happens, right? So luckily enough for a lot of us, we escape the clutches of the system like that, and we can just keep doing this kind of good work. But for me, the metamodernization part of it is like understanding the whole breadth of that metamodern theory of what's happening in film and culture and social movements, and how does it all fuse and coalesce and synthesize, because we're as millennials, I'm assuming, in this sort of cohort, we're all sort of like growing up through and evolving through the kind of like postmodern identity crisis that that we've had, and kind of coming on the other side of it. And so yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Could we hear a bit of an intro to like metamodernism in general? Because I feel like everybody knows what postmodernism is, but like not many people are talking about metamodernism.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'd say first that not many people really know what postmodernism means, because it's irreducible in a sense. Like, it actually means so many different things when you dive into the theory, that there's a lot of straw man versions about what postmodernism is. But granted, people have enough of an understanding as a sort of intensification of modernity, of modernization, then that's good enough. But metamodern theory, basically, it was first popularized around 2010 by two Dutch scholars, Vermeulen and Van den Akker, and they popularized it as kind of a cultural and art critic theory of the millennium, kind of what's happening post 2000. And they consolidated some of research about the postmodern turn, but they also glossed over some research. And so this is what I try to tell people, like, there's the kind of popular conception they might have, if they have one, kind of comes from that school of thought. But then there's actually some papers from the 1990s that were glossed over, that were quite interesting. And so those papers relate to the philosophy of technology, and sort of that bifurcation I allude to between hypermodernism and metamodernism. One is about liberation theology, and kind of the feeling of Latinos in America as kind of like second class citizens, but like also, vis-a-vis like Black and Indigenous people being oppressed, and liberation theology being such a large part of the Americas, like Central and South American culture. While they also have a history of being dominated by the church. So there's a kind of paradox between their faith in God as a means to liberation. And Martin Luther King is a kind of good example of liberation theology, and the social control that religion sort of orchestrates. another missed source in the 90s is what I call Black metamodernism, and that's actually a theory by a scholar about African American artists who went to Africa and were like transformed personally by their experiences and what they learned, and then came back to America with a kind of like reinvention or like converted or transformed identity and practice. And so trying to think, like, you know, Malcolm X like is somebody obviously, but he's not so much an artist. You know, the theory is referencing I think Basquiat just as an example. You know, I think of Dave Chappelle as an example, because he was a
Maya
great,
Angelou.
yeah, there's probably lots of people, if we dive really deep into that specific explanation of the theory, and each person's personal experience of their trip to Africa, it's for them to tell, right? It's not for me to tell. But I wrote about Black metamodernism, kind of picking up on these themes, and also like where Black political culture is at today in the United States. And of course, like you know, Cornel West, I point to as an example, and he was like one of Bernie Sanders's biggest surrogates, right? And so that's my kind of contribution in terms of what the scholarship says about metamodernism before these other people started writing about it. And then, you know, around 2015, there's this imaginary scholar named Hansi Freinacht, and that's a couple of, you know, Scandinavian dudes writing under a pen name, kind of having a think tank and a network in Europe of kind of, you know, progressive and sometimes centrist and what's called integralists, integral theory, people from a kind of personal development background, all coming together also to kind of a discourse under that that community, that Hansi community. So that's a kind of what I call the second school, like a Nordic school of metamodernism. And so these are like, I've tried to outline some of the formal theories that exist out there, but then there's just like the felt sense that we're having, right? And the different artifacts that scholars might point to, right? Like the show Community as a metamodern sitcom, you know. So it's just, it's hard because you have to get into the details of what they're saying, you know, and really reflect on the differences between like a sitcom in the 1990s, which may or may not have been meta, had meta elements, and 2000 sitcoms and 2010s, and just, you know, how these things are changing. And of course, I gotta say it's confusing because there's still modern and postmodern, you know, themes everywhere, right? Like modernization itself is still playing out and needs to be fulfilled, but it comes with this dark side, which postmodernism exposes and reveals, which is like modernization really meant the erasure of indigenous cultures and the enslavement and whatnot, and the maintenance of different social power structures in order to, you know, fulfill these ambitions of civilization, right? Of which the United States, like, manifest destiny being kind of their slogan for a while. And coming back to that theme of globalization is this unstoppable force that's like a function of the, you know, population growth and technological development. And it's only like the people who are, you know, either like really advanced in some sort of technology like you guys are, or people who are stopping and reflecting on the process to some sort of depth or iteration, that there's a fundamental shift in worldview and the way we live. Or when I say shift, I mean there's a crisis too. It's kind of preceded by a crisis and a breakdown. Like, you know, who am I? What am I doing? You know, how do I extricate myself from these systems of violence? You know, like when you buy a phone and there's rare minerals mined by slaves in Africa. Like, how do we reconcile the complexity and not just kind of shrug and go on with our lives? So
that point,
yeah.
if I can interject, also when we started today, we spoke with Manu from Buenos Aires who is pretty much just having a similar issue, and I think is a perfect example of how metamodernism helps us all kind of understand and get on the same page. And so, like, when I went to go look at what he was telling me, all I could find are stories about how protesters attacked the president. But the actual story is much more dire and a personal story. It's people's homes were attacked by terrorists, and they're considering that it was for lithium mining purposes. This is exactly what you're talking about: indigenous strain being placed for the globalization of places that are not even there. It's for our batteries and cars and laptops and things like that, where people there are struggling. $300 a month can easily support them.
Yeah, those are great points, and it invokes to my mind some of the things I'm trying to get at, like with Latin American politics. They're the political commentators I'm following, they're calling it the pink tide too at this point, because it's like there's a wave of socialism across South America, but then it gets pushed back by neoliberalism, right? So a couple years ago, there was a coup in Bolivia where the indigenous president was displaced, and it was that coup. He was replaced by like a far right politician, right? And that coup was supported by like the US, the State Department, and by like all the mainstream news outlets, sort of precisely because they didn't have the truth, and they didn't want the truth. They didn't care. And even people like Elon Musk were like tweeting in support of it, right? Just because there's this big red herring about what socialism is, and how they like to scapegoat it as the problem, the source of all the problems in the world. But Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, previously like lifted 40 million people out of poverty, and subsequently he was imprisoned sort of by a sort of coup in a sense, and a right-wing government was promoted into power. And and so we have this, the part of the metamodern discourse covers a lot of this stuff in a broad sense. Like Vermeulen and Van den Akker point to the theme of alter globalization, which refers to like the 19 WTO protests, and pretty much every sort of mass protest you've seen since then that is against the neoliberal status quo. And then when it comes to, the way the mainstream media handles these issues, because of laws changed around mass media in the 90s, I think maybe the Telecommunications Act, like a lot of these things, they're set up to fail. So then like the media can't cover these things. And so I think for the most part, the original authors of metamodernism are kind of, trying to thread the needle and peer through the cracks of the status quo. And these authors in particular, don't touch on something we call the meta crisis, right? And I think that's an intrinsic to a developed metamodern discourse, but through kind of metamodern circles, the Hansi School and Peter Limberg, who spoke today, he did a kind of symposium yesterday on the meta crisis, right? So having different speakers and Q&A, and kind of, we begin to touch on that theme that has escaped us for so long. And so to try to kind of bring it back to the political for me, and like in South America, there is a underlying truth waiting to be born. Like the United States is kind of a failed state because it's had its hand in holding the development of these other countries back. So there needs to be, I dream sometimes of some kind of like big disclosure moment, or crossing a threshold, like where really quickly, you see a lot of public figures having a kind of about face, and things start to change, and public discourse changes, and everything just gets easier. But that could just be my optimism, you know, kind of deluding me. You know, there could be no logic to that. But what I worry about with all the kind of sensationalization about the hyper modern world, you know, and dark enlightenment kind of things, is that we're manifesting this kind of doom scenario rather than actively trying to disarm it with an open heart. So, you know, I run into a wall again.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I think we're a little bit over time in general. You definitely given us a lot to think about. Pete or Tommy, do you have any last questions that you'd like to ask before we stop today?
I guess the final question I want to ask is, do you want to help start a meta news? I think Manu is on board, Miss Ant's on board. We started today. You're the end of it. Manu's the beginning.
Yeah, I'll do as much as I can just to you know, keep up with things and contribute. News is a tricky one because, like, you know, there's so much that needs to be unpacked with care and attention while also like trying to reach the maximum size audience at once. So
maybe news isn't the right word, but you know, a little bit more of things like this, sit around and talk about how it really is and the metamodernism of it all.
Sure. I'm down for any and all experiments like this, and especially, you know, I try to take a critical approach to everything. I want like things that go forward to be like self-audited as they go, so that as they're deployed, there's no unexpected consequences, you know, or trade-offs to make, but really everybody can be kind of supported. I don't just mean in our little circles or whatever, but like the vision of a socialist infrastructure is that like the things that are already codified as human rights, like healthcare and education, it's that means we actually have the institutional and logistical infrastructure to provide that.
Pete, do you have any closing thoughts or questions?
Not really. It's been a super long day.
I'll bet.
Well, thank you so much.
Long 3 days, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's going to go on for
just the beginning.
3 more weeks. 2.5.
Wow. Wow. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, PointBeing.
Cheers.